Hi, thank you very much, Charles. I'm Scott Malcomson. I'm the Director of Special Projects at Strategic Insight Group. I won't talk a lot about SIG. We do somewhat similar things to Menace and are very glad to be associated with them, including doing these occasional podcasts. I'm thrilled to be here with our two guests, Jim Ledbetter, Executive Editor of the New York Observer. I've known Jim for a very long time, almost as long as Menace has been around, but not quite. We were young journalists on the Village Voice in New York City many years ago. He went on to a very distinguished career as an editor of Inc. magazine, one of the founding editors before that of the industry standard, and it's always great to be with Jim. Hugo Gurdon, this is our first meeting, but it's a great pleasure. Hugo spent, when Jim and I were at The Voice, I think you were at the Daily Telegraph, slightly different part of the political spectrum, as a Washington correspondent, and of course now as the editor of the Washington Examiner. We're going to be talking about the midterm elections and what's likely to happen and what the likely aftermath is going to be. I just wanted to start with the obvious question: how do you think? Let's speculate as to how the elections will turn out in the House and the Senate. Jim, if you could kick off, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, thank you, Scott, and it's great to be here and to participate in this discussion. I'm gonna go with the great philosopher Yogi Berra. It's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future, and the future starts next week. I don't know what's going to happen. I have long assumed that the Republicans would retake the House by a fairly small margin. That assumption started to get a little clouded in the summer, particularly after the Roe v. Wade decision was overturned by the Supreme Court, and there was a lot of activity and enthusiasm on the left and among Democrats, and including massive voter registration drives in otherwise unlikely places like Kansas, right, and a couple of one-off races here and referenda there that suggests that there was some enthusiasm, on the left to turn out and vote. That seems to have dampened as the summer wore off and the fall began. And now, when you look at polls of keeping in mind that all elections are to some degree turnout elections, who comes out and votes matters a lot. Maybe even more than it should, or more than policy-driven thinking would lead you to believe. And right now, the enthusiasm for this round of elections seems to be much more among Republicans than among Democrats, and that indicates that a lot of the summer's kind of blue heat has subsided. I will also point out that while the policy impact of what happens once the elections are finished can be immense, and obviously we'll talk about that, the actual politics of it, the mechanics of it, are fairly minute. It's been discussed recently that you have 435 races in the House of Representatives, and only 59 of them are considered to be competitive. Incumbents are reelected, with great regularity in this country, and long have been. And even of those 59, 19 of those are open seats, or seats that have been newly created by redistricting. So fewer than 10% of the races are actually competitive. So when we do the assessments on the day after, or as these things go, the weeks after, particularly as the Senate is concerned, it's often portrayed as this kind of massive swing from one side to the other. Actually, it's a relative handful of races. But if Hugo can convince me that the Democrats are going to pull a sneak attack, I'd be very pleased.
I'm afraid I can't convince you of that. I would agree with you that it does depend a great deal on turnout. And as you say, the Republicans have more enthusiasm on their side than the Democrats do. There was a period during the summer where the decision in the Dobbs case, which overturned Roe versus Wade, it infused Democrats. But the Democrats, I think, have made a big blunder in focusing on abortion, despite the fact that all the public opinion surveys show that it's not the greatest concern. It's actually, it's something like 10th or something like that on the rankings of what people are concerned about. By far, the biggest issue is, and this accounts for about 2/3 of people. Is inflation, the economy, and if you include also the question, the 20% who say, the price of groceries, basically amounts to 2/3 of the people are saying that their most important issue for them is inflation. And the White House efforts to suggest that this is because of Putin and the war have just not been widely accepted. Everybody knows that inflation was 7% or a little over 7.1, I think it was, in March, before the war began. So the administration, there was just in the last day or so, there were a number of Democratic consultants who put out a plea to the Democrats to try and switch their messaging from abortion and Donald Trump to the economy. It's far too late for them to have done that, and they've wasted months and months and months talking about things that were not that the electorate was not interested in. And this was actually more, as we said in an editorial today, more of a canny move by the consultants, so that in a week and a half they'll say, "We told you so," and they'll attract a lot of Democrats to come and use their consultancy, and that's a way of picking up fees. It's just far too late. I want to remind everybody that the average number of seats that in the House that the president's party loses in the first midterms of his time in office is 25. That's the average. Even when the president is above 50%, I think that the average is something like 11 seats, and that would be enough to give the Republicans the control of the House. But this isn't even an average year. The inflation is at a 40-year high. Crime has surged in all over the place. Just to take New York City, for example, robbery is up 38%, grand larceny by 35%, and burglary up 33%. And you've got Kathy Hochul in a debate just the other day saying she didn't understand why this was important to her challenger, Lee Zeldin. It's the kind of tin-eared response. And I think that, I was talking to one of my commentary writers just the other day, and we were convinced that there must have been someone in the White House for the first 18 months or so who basically persuaded Biden and the Democrats that all they had to do was say that inflation was transitory or was an upper middle class problem, and you couldn't get, that your Peloton bike didn't turn up in time. And that would somehow persuade people. But what happens in these things is, and this election has done exactly this pattern. 8 months ago, it looked like a Republican landslide was baked into it. Then came Dobbs, and there was a summer, and as it's quite normal for things to look not quite as bad for the president's party several months out. But then as you get closer, you get into the home straight, peripheral issues and sort of fall away. The basics reassert themselves. And the basics in this election are inflation in the economy, massive concern about crime and policies that are deemed soft on crime, and a record influx of illegal immigrants across the southern border, all of which play right into Republican hands. So I am going to go stick my neck out here. I think that I expect the GOP to pick up 30 seats or more in the House. And just to go to the Senate, which is much more difficult to predict and much more on a knife edge, I think the lamentable performance of John Fetterman in the debate against Mehmet Oz in the Pennsylvania race the other night and the trend toward the Republicans will just bring Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania, which will mean that state is held by the Republicans. I think that in Nevada, Adam Laxalt, son or is it grandson? I can't remember, of a very popular governor, will win. So that's one pickup. I think that perhaps rather extraordinarily, Herschel Walker may well beat Warnock in Georgia. And there's even threats in New Hampshire to Maggie Hassan and elsewhere. I mean, I would probably say that I expect a 52-48 Republican Senate after the dust clears on November the 9th, or a few days later when the Pennsylvania results come in.
So it's extremely tempting to spend the rest of the hour on what the Democrats did wrong in the campaign and everything. But since the consensus seems to be that they'll lose Congress, the House, and possibly the Senate, maybe we should go on to what happens after the election. So obviously, with a Republican-dominated Congress, crime will cease to be an issue in America's cities. And what's the other thing? Oh, and inflation will be eliminated. What do you think of what do you think are the likely effects there? And I guess, Jim, why don't you go?
Sure. So just very quickly, I hope that none of our viewers are expecting or hoping for some kind of like crossfire, left versus right debate. It's not really my thing. I agree with Hugo that inflation has overtaken everything, and I would maybe think that if you could take inflation out of the equation, that the abortion messaging might have been more effective. I don't know. These are all quite speculative. I don't know. But if we are facing 2 years of a Republican-led House and Senate, I think a couple of things. One is there is among the business community a sentiment that gridlock is good. In other words, if you can't get anything done in Washington, that's probably better for business, because business can just go on doing what it's doing without too much change or interference. It's a cynical view, but I certainly hear it a lot. Remarkably, I mean, we're pretty close to gridlock now, and I would say the current Congress has been more productive than many, for better or worse, depending on your point of view. But if we have Republicans in office, I think you will definitely see an attempt to pass a federal ban on abortions, whatever that looks like, with exceptions for rape, incest, etc., or not. It won't pass as long as Biden is still president, but it will be an important rallying point for 2024. I think Joe Biden will be impeached. On what? It doesn't matter. The cycle that we're in right now is that the out party, if it controls the Senate and the House, will impeach the incumbent party of the White House, and they will find something, whether it's a Hunter Biden laptop or stolen aviator glasses. I don't know. It will be something, and there will be impeachment proceedings, and that will take up a lot of political theater for the next 2 years. Beyond that, I think the rest of the focus will be on economic matters. Scott, you made a joke about inflation disappearing. I don't think any of us are trained economists, but I would disagree a little bit with Hugo's implication that the Biden administration or take it, Biden administration plus Congress, whatever, is responsible for the current bout of inflation. I mean, I've seen the argument, but as I think a lot of people on this call will know, inflation right now is a global phenomenon. It's probably worse in many countries in Europe than it is right now in the United States. So it seems a little hard to pin it on the current government. However, unless these forces subside, it will be the big political animal in the room until until something else comes along.
Where should I think that with a Republican-controlled Congress, the political landscape will change very considerably in Washington. The Congress, I'm not sure whether I agree that there would be impeachment proceedings. That I suppose is an unpleasant possibility. There will certainly be more Republican investigations, just as actually a result of some of the reporting that we did on the Hunter Biden laptop. The Republicans have actually said that they will open a look at that. They want to find out more about who the big guy was who was going to take a 10% cut of Hunter's lucrative overseas flows of money. So and the Republicans will, I mean, just as after 2010, when the Republicans picked up 63 seats, they blocked all sorts of spending. They didn't want to give any sort of wins to Obama. I think that it's almost cost-free opposition for the Republicans, because if the economy is bad, and by the way, already 66% of Americans already think that the country is already in recession. Right. Throughout the course of the next 2 years, both sides will be looking towards the presidential election. There is no margin for the Republicans to, there's no benefit to them allowing any wins for Biden. They will oppose spending. So I think one of the consequences will be much more rhetoric about fiscal restraint. They will use the debt ceiling debate, which I believe comes up again next year, as leveraged for spending cuts of some kind or another, or negotiations. I imagine that, the 2017 tax cuts from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act don't expire until 2025. And so those will be a big deal in the presidential election throughout 2024, but that is not actually something which Congress has to do and won't have to do in the second half of the Biden first term. I suspect the GOP will use its new leverage to prevent the IRS from getting an extra $80 billion, which is what it got in a recent piece of legislation. If the Republicans win both chambers, or even if they just win the House, I think the chances of a bipartisan antitrust bill focused on big tech declines. So there will be trench warfare in a way that there has not been here in the first 2 years, because obviously both the legislature and the executive have been in Democratic hands. I guess that's
well.
Yeah.
Let me just follow up on a couple of things. Hugo, I would like to know whether you agree that there is likely to be an attempt at a federal ban on abortion. And Jim, particularly given your background, I'm very curious what you think about tech antitrust over the next 2 years, and whether in fact that would decline under the Republicans, or what the other dynamics there might be.
On a federal ban. I don't know. I was very surprised when immediately after the Dobbs decision, Kevin McCarthy said he was open to consider a federal ban, because for decades, Republicans have been arguing that this should be up to the states. and you know, it seemed to me a sort of lamentable move politically. I mean, whatever you think of it morally, a lamentable political move to suggest that now that that it's become optional for the states, that you no longer make it optional and you rule out the option. So I think that, and I think that there was a referendum in, or not a referendum, what do you call it? Anyway, there was a vote in Kansas to change the constitution, I believe, and it went down in flame which basically make abortion illegal. It went down in flames, like something like 60-40. And so that the Republicans really burned their fingers on that. And I think that there will be a considerable resistance in the Republican Party for political reasons. That doesn't mean to say that there won't be an effort. I think it's highly likely that a Republican or a group of Republicans for whom abortion is the biggest issue of all will try and bring a bill forward. I think that it would be maybe McCarthy, who will be the next speaker, will allow that to come forward. I think it would be, I don't think it would be politically astute, as I say, never mind what you think of it morally. I don't know that, I'm sure that Mitch McConnell will not want to deal with that in the Senate. As Jim said, no such thing will pass, but whether the Republicans, I'm slightly dubious, as I am actually slightly dubious about impeachment. I just think that those things may, on balance, be deemed politically deleterious to their own interests. So that's where I stand on that.
So let me say, let the McCarthy years begin. That has a weird ring. Hugo, if I can suggest a schemata for you to understand how the Republican Party thinks about Federalist issues. If they are in favor of the issue, then it should be national. If they are against the issue, then it should be states' rights, whether it's abortion or gay marriage. There is literally no consistency on these issues over the decades, except expediency. That is the only thing that matters. Now that they have the power, the extreme forces, who are also very important in terms of fundraising of the Republican Party, will push for a federal abortion ban. They won't get it because of the gridlock that we discussed. But the idea that the majority of voters oppose such a thing will stop them from doing it, I think you should purge from your mind. In terms of antitrust, I think on a legislative level, I agree with Hugo that very little will change over the next couple of years. The funny thing about tech and antitrust is that both parties have very strong opinions about why Mark Zuckerberg and his ilk are evil. There's a lot of rhetoric around that. But they come at it from such a different approach. The Democrats tend to think that bigness and influence and kind of hate speech, etc., are per se a reason to oppose the monopolistic tendencies of social media platforms. On the right, it's more like, oh, you're censoring the results of search, and you're preventing Donald Trump from being able to tweet, et cetera. And that has had, over the last several years, again, a kind of gridlock effect that nothing gets done. I don't see that changing, or to the extent that it changes, I think Hugo is right. It will there'll be less impetus on the policy level. Hard to say. We just this week saw a U.S. court shoot down the proposed merger of Simon Schuster and Penguin Random House, which would be a publishing conglomerate so large that you can't even put it in one name. And I think that there's been a renaissance of sorts with antitrust in the Biden administration, but those regulatory bodies and the courts themselves, they can really read the election returns like anybody else. If the signals come from Republican voters and legislators that antitrust is not something that's at the top of the agenda, you'll probably see a little bit of a slowdown.
Let me ask you both. I personally in my household, we try to avoid talking about Donald Trump, and there's a strong argument that the Democrats have really been wounded by their single-minded focus on Trump and January 6th and everything else. But be that as it may, Trump will probably be alive and kicking after the midterm elections. How do each of you see his, assuming as you both do that the Republicans control at least the House, if not the Senate as well, how does that affect Trump as a player within the party? It seems like it can go in a lot of different directions. So
yes, I think it can. I mean, Trump has had obviously a long and lamentable impact on quite a few Republican candidates. I mean, there are, I believe, at least a couple of hundred who are running who deny that he lost the election, and who subscribe to the nonsense that it was stolen. That's obviously it's a real problem for the party because, but as you say, there are various different strands to this, and many of them are conflicting. One of the things that's been interesting is that a number of candidates that Trump backed in the primaries lost. I mean, for example, he absolutely detests Brian Kemp in Georgia, and he even joked that he would. I mean, I don't even know if it was a joke, but that he would prefer to see Stacey Abrams elected governor there. And there have been several examples, many examples, in fact, of Donald Trump's candidates losing the primaries to more sort of orthodox candidates. Nevertheless, he's also got a number of different candidates who he has endorsed. I mean, just for example, Blake Masters in Arizona, who has a chance of knocking off Mark Kelly in the Senate race. And typically of Trump, of course, he has also seen which way the wind is blowing, and a day before someone's about to win the primary, he says, "Oh, that's my guy," so that he can claim credit thereafter. But one thing that I think it has been very useful to Democrats, and I can understand why they would do it, is to try and make sure that everybody thinks that the Republican Party is Donald Trump's party, because I mean they would love, I think, just to run against Donald Trump, because Biden's already shown that Donald Trump can be beaten. I think that if Donald Trump is not the nominee, and I suspect he will not be, it's a much harder task for the Democrats to win the next presidential election. But I know when there was talk about the possibility, and Trump teased the possibility that he would announce his run for the White House before the midterms. I suppose they've still got a few days he might do it, but it seems less likely. When that was a possibility, I was actually talking in various meetings with Republican leaders up on Capitol Hill, and the possibility or the prospect of that absolutely dismayed and horrified them, because what they are trying to do, and one can just accept or like this, approve of it, or whatever, is they are treating they want to get past Donald Trump. They don't want him anymore. They don't want to alienate his voters. They are treating, unlike Liz Cheney, who obviously is now kind of fallen out of favor, they don't regard it as a moral imperative to stand up and use a megaphone at every possibility to denounce Donald Trump, because they know that there's 30% of the electorate and probably a good half of their own voters who they cannot afford to lose if they want to win an election, and who they therefore must not alienate by going above and beyond to denounce Trump. So they are treating the treatment of Trump as a strategic and tactical matter rather than as a moral one. And I think that that's a legitimate thing to do. If you don't want to cede government to your opposing party, you don't, hobble your own chances. But it certainly is not the case that the leaders up on Capitol Hill want Trump to be the nominee. I think they would be delighted if it were DeSantis. They'd be happy if it were Greg Abbott or Pompeo. So he's around. I am one of those who have always been skeptical that he will even run. He certainly, it seems to me, will not announce early, because that imposes all sorts of constraints on him from a financial point of view. But the other thing is that being the president, or indeed the nominee, he may calculate gives him some inoculation against prosecution, and which is another thing he might be concerned about. There are a lot of Republicans and Democrats who believe that he's going to get indicted sometime after the midterms.
Jim, do you have a thought, or do you more or less agree with that?
Yeah,
before we move on to the Democrats, I'm sure. Yeah.
I hate to disappoint the audience, but I find myself in violent agreement with Hugo, who has his finger much more on the pulse of Republican leadership than I do. But my perception on this is that Trump created a kind of a loose movement with some paramilitary fringe aspects that we saw on January 6th. But he created a movement that will outlast him and has kind of overtaken him. I think Trump is increasingly irrelevant to the Trumpians that he has created, and that is the problem that Republican leadership has to deal with, that Hugo describes so well. I'm reminded very much of the Tea Party and the influence that it had, in Congress. John Boehner, who was the speaker, said in his memoir, I just realized that I live in crazy town and I just got elected mayor. That is the reality that I think McCarthy and McConnell are going to have to deal with, and it puts them in a bind. It has great utility in certain local races, in a lot of local races actually, but on the national level, I think it does hurt the party, because they can't, as Hugo said, the Republican leadership is almost like they're in the closet with Donald Trump. They can't come out and say, yeah, no, we hate the guy. We don't want him to run. It would be a disaster. So they have to kind of keep this secret. And I think on some level, the electorate understands that and will punish them for it. I also agree with Hugo that I don't think he's going to run. You have to understand, Donald Trump is in very serious legal trouble right now. There are multiple lawsuits, including a criminal lawsuit in Manhattan that, while it won't send anyone to jail, could seriously hamper his business's ability to raise money going forward. This having to do with lying about the valuation of properties and tax fraud and sort of all these things that they flipped his accountant and CFO on. So there's also the Georgia case, and it's too much. I don't think that Trump can face down all of these legal issues and run his business and run for president. The guy is guided by himself, so I could easily be wrong, but I think it's a recipe for disaster if he runs. I think DeSantis is a much more likely candidate and nominee.
Well, let's talk about the Democrats a little bit, and then I'll get into foreign affairs. We've got some great questions that have come in so far that, and I promise listeners that I'll try to hit all of them. So, Biden says that he'll wait until after the midterm results to decide if he's going to run again. Okay, so hoping we don't have to wait too much longer. It's not clear to me that the Democratic Party really wants Joe Biden to run again a whole lot more than the Republican Party wants Trump to run again. I personally feel like I'm in a hostage situation with the baby boomer generation and would like to see something else happen. But so throwing all those variables out there, after the midterm doesn't go well for the Democrats. We're assuming that. What is the Democratic Party, what is it likely to do, either at the top leadership level or at even at an ideological level?
I think the Democratic Party is in very difficult position now. They've been preparing probably for 3 or 4 months to abandon Joe Biden. He really served only one function for them, which was to defeat Donald Trump, and he ran as a centrist, even if that's not the way that he has governed. He ran as an alternative to Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. He won. The party has waited a decent 18 months so that it didn't look like this was the plan all the time. I mean, perhaps it wasn't. Maybe it was just kind of implicit before starting to talk about his age, which was, of course, an issue. He ran at the age of 78. He's by far the oldest president. I remember when Reagan was running at the age of 69, and people thought, "Oh, can he possibly handle it?" He was nearly a decade younger than Biden is running. The idea that Biden would run again at the age of 82 and would end his second term closer to the age of 90 than to the age of 80 is just an absurdity. And I just think that he's already showing signs of physical and mental decline. And that's an opinion which gets piled on by people who are supporting, but I think that his own party has decided that he's not the best. The problem he faces, or that they face, is that his deputy, his vice president, is even more unpopular and has been even less successful than he over the last 2 months. I think 2 years. Kamala Harris did very poorly in the presidential election primaries of 2020. She dropped out before the Iowa caucuses. She was chosen as vice president because the Democrats boxed, Biden in particular, but the Democrats generally boxed themselves in by saying that they were going to choose a vice president who was a black woman. And so she was sort of an obvious choice, except no good at what she does, no good at politics. So what the Democrats want to get to is Biden saying he's not going to run again. But the trouble with that is that it turns him into a lame duck. And therefore, it makes their administration even weaker for the last 2 years of his tenure. He becomes a lame duck if he does that early. If he doesn't do it early enough, then no one is in a position, no Democrats can say, this president has to go. They can get punished for in their own efforts to become president by turning against their own president. So they're in a quandary. What they would like to get to is the Biden having withdrawn a primary in which all the candidates can, who want to run, can run. I don't know that any of them stands out as being very strong, at least the ones that I have in mind. But the big problem they face is how you get from here to there. They know where they want to get. They don't know how to get there, and it's very difficult to get there. It's just as far as the leadership is concerned. The Democratic leadership is extraordinarily old. Nancy Pelosi's 82, Steny Hoyer's 82, Jim Clyburn, I think, is 80 or 81. The spring chicken of the group is Chuck Schumer, and he's 72 or 73. Now, Mitch McConnell is old, but there's but Republicans are in general much younger. Any one of the Democratic leaders except Schumer would delight to be mistaken for a boomer. They were all born before the baby boom began. So the Republicans generally are boomers, and it's very interesting that in Congress, the decile that grew, the two deciles that were the fastest growing were those over the age of 80 and those over the age of 50. Those were the biggest increases. The one where there was the biggest decrease was people below the age of 30. I think it was below the age of 30 or in their 30s. I can't remember. So this is easily the oldest Congress there has been. And so there is a big block. And I think there are probably a lot of frustrated Democrats in particular who would normally or historically by now have been in positions of authority. But the seniority system in Congress that the Democrats continue to have and the Republicans abandoned has meant that they have this sclerotic leadership, and they do need to clean house and bring in some younger blood.
Jim, a few thoughts?
Yeah. So I again, sorry, find myself in great agreement with Hugo's analysis.
I'm going to start disagreeing with both of you just for
Please,
the hell of it.
you must. I'm baffled as to why Biden has not, what's the phrase, fish or cut bait about this long ago. I mean, even before he was elected, there was some discussion where he said, I'm just going to serve one term. And I think he should have said that from the get-go and said that Kamala will be the presumptive nominee for 2024 and get out of the way and just end all this, relentless gossip and hand-wringing. I would not judge Kamala Harris's political prospects from her primary performances. I think that's a little unfair, but more importantly, a little kind of analytically just wrong. I would say that she's been about as invisible a vice president as a vice president, kind of is, and that's an issue. But I do think she has some political strengths that could come to the fore if Biden would just come out and say that he's not going to run. The other thing that I would say in terms of the gerontocracy are being ruled by sclerotic leaders, which I agree is a major issue, is that it's not strictly a U.S. phenomenon. Definitely the case in Italy. Definitely the case for the most part in Japan. And if there is a way, I mean, I'm very intrigued by Hugo's implication that the Republicans have figured out a way to solve that. I'm not sure I agree, but I want to know more. But we need fresh blood, whether at the presidential level, congressional leadership level. We have to have something other than a seniority system that just gives us senior citizens.
Let me just float very quickly something that John Sununu said a couple of days ago on a call. His theory was that actually having Republican control of Congress would provide the opportunity for the president's party to cease wasting all of its political energy blocking itself from doing anything as a group, and that it actually could start to operate more coherently in a Republican-dominated Congress, agreeing on policies, knowing that the president will either veto or approve, so that they'll be able to essentially, as a party, take credit for that which he approves and hit their opponents for that which he vetoes. Weird to take Democratic advice from Sununu, but I was just kind of slightly intrigued by it. Any very quick thoughts? And then
just very briefly, I think that it's what he says is true. It's almost always the president's party loses the midterm elections in the first, but most often presidents are re-elected. So facing a weaker support in Congress appears, at least historically, to be helpful to the president. That doesn't, so the problem with the is for the Democrats is that it is mostly the centrists who will lose because they are in the marginal seats where it required a centrist to win. The people who are least vulnerable are in both parties are the ones who are on the more extreme levels. So extremes on ideology. But I think that Sununu is broadly speaking right. It can a loss and a substantial loss could be salutary and might help the Democrats be more coherent.
Jim, a thought other than the look of extreme skepticism? Okay, you're going to pass.
I'm going to pass and move on. We've got 12 minutes, and I think we have other things to discuss.
Okay, so I did want to want you to talk a bit about foreign policy. I would think both Ukraine and China. China has been that rare instance of bipartisan agreement, more or less, and Biden has basically taken most of Trump's policies, or at least his attitudes towards China, and driven them even harder. Will that survive having a change in power in Congress? And similar question on Ukraine. Obviously, that's the opposite because there's a lot of party division and argument over what's the right thing to do in Ukraine.
If it's okay for me to go, I'll actually take both Ukraine and China together because I think there is the link. Yes, I do think that the broad bipartisanship will continue. The Biden administration just, for example, recently talked about putting B-52s in Australia. They are going to be much more hawkish towards China than, for example, the Obama administration was. There will be a difference in degree, however. It's sort of a rite of passage in the Republican Party to be anti-China, and it fits the sort of American exceptionalism and new Cold War feeling that there is much more strongly there. I am aware of legislation coming forward, not from the Republican side. I can't reveal who it's going to come from, but it's not coming from some extremist, but which will limit the ability of limit trade in technology and anything which has military uses by American companies with companies associated with the PLA. There will also be, because of the way the Republicans are, much more rhetorical pressure on the Biden administration to be more anti-China. And there'll be some specifics too, which is to say, Republicans will say, stop, take these F-22s, which are in Europe, and move them to the Pacific. Stop sending frigates to the Mediterranean because of Ukraine. They need to be in the Pacific. There will be more pressure. The Republicans will put pressure on Biden to get the European allies, Italy, Germany, others, to take more of the burden of their own defense and Ukraine. And just so you know, I mean, they have small militaries in Europe, of course, but they have often very good equipment. The Americans are actually buying Italian frigates. So there's very good equipment over there, but there will be pressure on America by the Republican Party on Europe to do more for themselves. There will be Republicans are more skeptical about the efforts in Ukraine. They certainly think that it should not be Americans, bearing. It shouldn't be America bearing the burden.
Jim,
yes,
it's your go. Although I must I have to point out, having been in this racket for a while, that Democrats and Republicans alike want to and never succeed at getting more spending in Europe on defense. But sorry, Jim, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, especially in recent years, Scott, I've taken my cues on China from you. My view is that very little changes because China doesn't really change. We hope to find a different entry point to improve the relationship or change the dynamic, and we all understand that on big issues like climate change and globalization that cooperation is probably better than heated competition, but nothing changes, and I don't expect a Republican-led Congress to change that dynamic. On Ukraine, it's interesting. There was so much solidarity with Ukraine when the invasion first happened in February, that there seems to be a bit of fatigue that creeps in there. I see Republicans complaining on the budget side. I see others complaining that not enough is being done, that NATO could do more. I think a lot will depend on how long this conflict lasts, and whether Putin is available to bargaining on some level. The Putinization of the Republican Party is sort of a real thing. I don't know how much it plays here, but obviously there have been a lot of important Republican groups like the NRA that have been more or less infiltrated by Russian agents and Russian money, but whether that matters, whether that kicks in as regards Ukraine, it's hard to say.
Hugo, any further thought on the Putinization of various Republican institutions before we go on?
No, the only thing that I would say is that the NRA is not that important anymore. I'm not aware of the extent to which it is being Putinized, but
there are some interesting suits in the U.S. Attorney's Office that you should look at.
Okay.
So there have been a number of questions that all kind of get at the same point, and I'm not sure we're going to really be able to come up with an answer, but it's interesting that so many people are focused on the same problem, which is essentially a kind of paralysis, whether at the top or in the middle of the American political system. And it also raises the question, who makes foreign policy if the government continues to be so paralyzed? But even apart from the foreign policy question, there's nothing in what either of you have said that suggests that there's going to be a de-blockage of this, except maybe for the sudden arrival of the Grim Reaper in the halls of Congress. So do either of you see any sort of unblockage of the system, or is it just, are we just kind of stuck for the next 2 to 6 years?
I would love to weigh in on this. I note this week. I note this week that Collins Dictionary named permacrisis as the word of the year. And the reason why I love this is that I feel like many of the largest countries in the world, not just the United States, are kind of rerunning the same show all the time. We have 3 elections in the UK, in a very short period of time, all around kind of issues of Brexit and how Brexit should be administered, and can it be administered, and is it causing inflation, and sort of all these things. Israel, Netanyahu might win again. What, wasn't he prime minister forever? And we're in a Groundhog Day moment of kind of G7 politics, and I don't see a way out of it. Until, as you say, some of these major actors kind of pass on. Some of it is the result of polarization, but I think there's something beyond that we haven't yet quite identified, that is both extremely frustrating and I think quite damaging, as some of the questions indicate, to our ability to actually govern.
I would just add one thought on that. And I think that part of what we're seeing now, one of the reasons why things can't move, is that, and why there's just been an extraordinary decline in the caliber of the leaders, all over there. And one of the reasons for that seems to me to be that, just good people who would be good leaders are just not going into politics. A lot of them are not going into politics anymore. That's partly because policy, it seems difficult to change policy. There's been this sort of a kind of consensus about, on globalization and various things like that, where I think that a lot of people who might previously have thought, okay, politics is the line that I want to go into, and they're dynamic and effective, etc. They're instead going into business and making themselves very wealthy, etc., etc. And we've got a lot of second-rate people leading nations, and that it's difficult. That's partly because the best people can't pass personnel, but it isn't just passing personnel. It's it's exposing themselves to the kind of the transparency and the sunlight and the or whatever of the internet. There's just the working in the fishbowl in that way. It's just, I think politics has become a less attractive thing to some of the people who might in the past have been very strong leaders.
I'm very glad to learn that the business community is being led so well. It's news.
Well, speaking of the business community, do you think this GOP victory in Congress will have a strong effect on the deficit? If so, why and what?
Now, both parties have been terrible spenders. It seems to me there's been no fiscal restraint. I mean, you still hear some people talking about fiscal restraint in the Republican Party, but when they are running the show, they don't show any signs of it. I don't think it'll. I think that the Republicans, if it will stop any major spending bills in the next couple of years, whether that's for financial and fiscal reasons or for political ones to block Biden, is kind of perhaps neither here nor there. But I think that there won't be any big $1 trillion spending bills as there have been in the last 2 years. The deficit and the debt is just, I mean, obviously it's costing twice as much now to service the debt with interest rates high. I don't think that picture is going to get any better. I mean, the forecasts are for, massive deficits as far as the eye can see. Essentially, America now, instead of going into debt to finance big things like the Second World War, now accumulates debt just for current expenses, and I don't see any change in that.
Jim?
I agree. There's this idea on the left of modern monetary theory, MMT, which basically says that deficits don't matter. And the best line I've heard in years is modern monetary theory is what Republicans actually do when they hold office.
One last question. We're right on the hour. I really would love to get your thoughts on this, though, because China has made it possible for the United States to have a bipartisan industrial policy for the first time in a while. You're both saying, Hugo, more strongly that China policy will continue to be bipartisan in a GOP-dominated Congress. Does that mean that the U.S. somewhat novel industrial policy, as symbolized by two of Biden's rare legislative victories, is going to be a bit of a new normal in the next 2 years?
I think I'm happy to weigh in. I mean, I think it's a really, really interesting question and a really interesting dynamic. Scott, you said rare victories, but I mean, having both the CHIPS Act and the infrastructure bill, which has all sorts of other implications, come in the same year is quite an achievement, actually, historically. Trump talked a lot about reviving the industrial sector, the manufacturing sector within the United States, and there was a little bit of that went on under his administration. Now, though, I think if government really puts its muscle behind these efforts, that we could have something like what we used to call industrial policy in the 80s, and that has been deployed with great success in places like France and Germany, and it's a real thing. Is it bipartisan? Does it last if Republicans take over both houses of Congress? Hard to say, but the margin in Congress today is so small that I think something like the CHIPS Act represents an idea that maybe a certain part of the Republican Party wants that too. I don't want to come down too hard on it, but there's a real possibility there.
Yeah, it's not an area that I feel myself that much an expert on. I think that China has clearly emerged. It's acknowledged in the latest strategic document, as I think as weak as that document was, it was nevertheless acknowledged that China is a rival, not just a rival, but wants to displace the United States as the most powerful country and in the world. There's a growing understanding and acknowledgement of that here. The extent to which that influences industrial policy is very difficult. The problem is that China is very attractive, not just to other countries around the world, but also to many Americans. It makes things that Americans want. It's much, much harder to have an industrial policy that excludes China or limits China than it was to have a policy like that towards the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had nothing to offer ordinary Americans. And ordinary Americans only have to sort of turn once around their room and they see 60 products that come from China. I think 1 in every $5 spent on imports in America is spent on Chinese manufacturers. And I was actually surprised to find it was that little. I thought it would probably be more, but anyway, 1 in $5. It's extremely difficult in a democratic system to have policies which are actually going to push the price of goods up and goods and remain popular, as the Democrats are currently finding. If the policy excludes the free trade or trade with China or limits it, etc., that'll be quite difficult for the United States to push. So, I mean, I think that China is in a very strong position vis-a-vis America at the moment, and of course, it's becoming increasingly strong vis-a-vis the military as well.
I hate to end on that note, but Charles, anything further from you, or shall we wrap up? You'll have to unmute yourself, Charles.
No, thank you very much indeed to you and also to our two speakers. Just to say that we'll send out the podcast tomorrow, and so if you haven't, you can then go over it then. And we look forward to seeing you next time. So once again, thank you, Scott and Hugo and to Jim. All right.
Thanks very much for having me.
All right. Many thanks to everyone. Bye.
Bye.